Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I'm very pleased this morning that my question to the Minister has been accepted, and I'm grateful for the Minister being here to answer the question, because I'm here to make an appeal on behalf of the Natural Environment Minister that they would finally receive their fair share of lottery funding for the fantastic work they do up and down the length and breadth of the country on a variety of community conservation, habitat protection and wildlife protection projects, and it's a very broad spectrum in terms of the natural environment. Wisely, I think the government back in 2013, when it introduced the new national lottery bill, it did agree to an amendment at that time to incorporate the natural environment as one of the 6 qualifying categories and sectors that could apply for lottery funding, along with other sporting and community categories and sectors. However, Minister, to their dismay, none of the bodies and none of the organisations that are represented by the umbrella group, the Irish Environmental Network, which has over 30 different NGOs that make it up, have been able to secure any lottery funding since. Now, I know the lottery funding is dispersed through a variety of perhaps up to 8 different departments, but it does seem unfair, to say the least, that while they have been able to put forward many projects of merit deserving of support from national lottery funding, it does seem bizarre, to say the least, that while they have been included as a qualifying category and sector, they haven't been able to draw down any national lottery funding to date. And I'm hoping that in the next round of funding that perhaps could be rectified and put to rights. Because, Minister, we do have a difficulty in this country with what has been referred to as implementation deficit disorder. And that's very often due to local resistance and suspicion, and sometimes rightly so and well-founded, of what they see as state agencies trying to impose structures and projects on the community. And that's why I believe this organic projects that are built by communities from the ground up, which have local ownership, which have community buy-in, which are collaborative projects with state agencies, but with community direct input from the ground. They work very well in terms of conservation, habitats protection, biodiversity, education, ecotourism, the value of the landscape, wildlife, flora and fauna, and so on. And in fact, you know, it's estimated that this range of activity is worth up to $2 billion per annum to our economy. And as I said, spearheaded and under bodies like the Irish Environmental Network and Irish Rural Link. But to date, in terms of lottery funding, they certainly have been the poor relation. And I can see on the ground in my own community the projects, the successive projects, such as Abbeleg's Bog, the Portarlington Community Development Association, the Mountmellick Justice and Environment Group, which is inspired and led by the local Presentation Sisters, the great work they have done to restore areas, to restore river walks, to reclaim bogs, and to make them available to communities to enjoy. It has climate change benefits. It has all sorts of eco and environmental dividends. And again, the community are proud of these and they feel they have ownership of them. And they're spread right across the country. I mean, Fenor Bog in Waterford, the Wexford Slops and Wildlife Sanctuary, Clara Bog in Offaly, Ballybay Wetlands up in Monaghan, Cabra Wetlands in Tipperary, Ballyhora down in Limerick. They're right across the country. I think there's a great opportunity here for the government. By supporting them, we'll get really good bang for our buck. You really get good value when you support these kind of community organisations, because the dividend in terms of community buy-in, in terms of public participation, and in terms of tourism, the economic and environmental benefits can just not be over-exaggerated. And I think we would really get good value for money. And I think that was the purpose and pure intention and real intention of national lottery funding when it was first founded in 1986. I don't want to be picking on anyone, but it was never my view that it should be there to supplement, or sorry, to replace core government funding for services. It was to be an add-on of benefit to communities. It was supposed to be of benefit in that regard. I don't think it was. I know that the Cathaoirleach is an avid and enthusiastic golfer, but I don't think national lottery fundings were ever intended, for instance, to build new golf clubs. I don't think that was the purpose or design of what was intended. It was supposed to be additional resources where voluntary and community organisations were supposed to be the main beneficiaries. And I'd like to see us, you know, going back to being grounded in that kind of merit and grounded in that kind of principle when we're allocating national lottery fundings in the future and in the next round, but particularly that we make up for lost ground in terms of projects that pertain to the natural environment. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I'd like to thank Senator Whelan for raising this matter and giving me the opportunity to respond on behalf of my colleague, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Brendan Howlin, who's unable to attend. I'll begin, I think, by giving a background to the sale of the National Lottery licence. In view of the economic challenges prevailing, the Government decided to explore the opportunities presented by the expiry of the National Lottery licence and agreed in April of 2012 that there would be a competitive process for the award of the next licence. The key drivers were to yield upfront revenues for the state to fund projects such as the Wild Atlantic Way, the 1916 commemorations, the National Sports Campus and the new National Children's Hospital, and to strengthen annual revenues for good causes, which will benefit worthwhile projects throughout this country for the next 20 years. The National Lottery Act of 2013, which Senator Whelan referred to, provided for the holding of a national lottery on behalf of the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, for the establishment of the Office of the Regulator of the National Lottery, and to define the functions of that regulator. The overarching function of the regulator is to ensure that the National Lottery is run with all due propriety, that the interests of participants in the National Lottery are protected, and that the long-term sustainability of the National Lottery is safeguarded. Subject to this, an additional function is that revenue for good causes is importantly maximised. The National Lottery provides funds for good causes in accordance with the National Lottery Act of 2013. The areas to be funded are set out under Section 41(1) of the National Lottery Act as follows: sport and recreation, national culture and heritage, including the Irish language, the arts within the meaning of the Arts Act of 2003, health of the community, youth welfare and amenities, natural environment, which was added in the 2013 Act, and such other objectives, if any, as the Government may determine from time to time. Funding is provided by the Oireachtas in accordance with the Act through expenditure subheads, which form part of the departmental programmes. For over a decade, the total allocation of these subheads has exceeded the amount available from the National Lottery. These subheads are described as being part funded by the National Lottery, and the balance of the expenditure allocation for the subhead comes from normal exchequer sources, in other words, tax revenue or borrowing. Senators may wish to note that a breakdown by department of all expenditure areas that are supported by the proceeds of the National Lottery is set out in Appendix 1 of the Annual Revised Estimates for Public Services 2015, which is available on the website of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. During the debate on the National Lottery Bill in 2013, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform accepted an amendment proposed by Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan and supported by others to include the natural environment as a category that could benefit from lottery funding for good causes. However, to date, as Senator Whelan says, lottery money has not been applied to this area. The Government's response to proposals submitted in the future for lottery funding for the natural environment will take account of the level of funds available for good causes in the relevant years and the impact that it would have on other areas already in receipt of lottery funds. It is important to note that should national lottery funding be provided for the natural environment, corresponding reductions would be required in other areas which are currently in receipt of such funding. Accordingly, reallocation of funding to support the natural environment at the expense of one or more of these other sectors can only be undertaken following careful reflection. The Minister for the Environment, Community and Local Government is aware of this position, and this is a matter which we are keeping under review. In addition, I'd like to draw Senator Whelan's attention to the fact that since 2011, some €259 million has been disbursed to the environment sector from the Environment Fund. To this should be added some €146 million provided to the environment sector by way of the Exchequer voted expenditure by the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government. The Minister for the Environment considers that given the prevailing challenging budgetary context in which the Government operates, the allocation of such a considerable amount of funding to environmental initiatives does represent a commitment to the environment sector. Senators will be aware that funds for good causes have been in decline in recent years. It is hoped that this trend will be reversed and that there will be a growth in lottery sales out into the future years. This in turn will provide more revenue for good causes, and the question of applying funding in the area of the natural environment could be reviewed again at that stage.
A brief question.
Yeah, just a brief supplementary. Look, thanks very much, Minister. It's a very comprehensive reply, and I do accept that the Government across a range of other funding tranches through the Department of the Environment does indeed provide valuable support for many community projects in that category and in that sector. But I suppose there would have been very little point in adding the natural environment as a category, as a qualifying category in the 2013 Act in good faith, accepting the amendment, as you said, if we do not intend to follow through on it. I don't think it's a question of displacement for other worthy causes. Of course, there are challenges in terms of competition for the limited resources, but I think on merit, any of the projects I have mentioned across the country would stand up to scrutiny in giving good value for money, not only to the government but to communities for generations to come. And I think that is really what we really have to look at, and I do think we have to ensure that it wasn't just a sort of a cosmetic exercise at the time to include them and then not to follow through with funding, Minister.
Thank you, Gerlach. Thank you, Senator. No, I think you can take it very clearly that the reason Minister Whelan accepted the amendment from Deputy O'Sullivan in the Dáil was that he wanted to have the flexibility and the availability for the government of the day to provide such funding to the natural environment, when government is looking at the pot of money available, if you like, should that be possible. I've had an engagement with some of the NGOs in the environment sector on this. This is something that will be kept under review. As I've said, both the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Public Expenditure are aware of it. We do hope now with the new operation of the National Lottery, the lotto sales could begin to increase, which would obviously give a greater pool of money, which could then be dispersed to good causes. So this is something that will be kept under review, and I'll certainly relay your very strong feelings to the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. Thank you.